My name is Emily Mercer. I'm 32 years old. The night my father called me uneducated trash, I didn't shed a single tear, plead with him, or attempt to justify myself. I simply stood at the far end of his birthday dinner table while everyone around me turned to stone and watched him hurl words at me like I was something disgusting he wanted wiped from existence. He told me I was worthless. He told me that having money didn't make a person worth respecting. He ordered me out of his home. What made it even more devastating was that I had spent years quietly keeping that family afloat through crises they never even knew I had funded. By that point, I had already built a business that generated $31 million for me personally. But sitting in that room, none of it counted for anything. To them, I was still the daughter who had abandoned college, shattered the family blueprint, and chosen a path they couldn't dictate. So I held his gaze steadily and said, "Okay, fine." Then I picked up my bag and walked out without raising my voice a single time. I was through the door before anyone gathered the nerve to try to stop me. By the time the sun came up, I had sealed my life into cardboard boxes, turned my phone face down on the counter, and left Indianapolis behind without a word of farewell to anyone. 3 weeks later, the very people who had sat there watching me get thrown out would be choking on a reality they had spent years dismissing. And for the first time in my entire life, I wouldn't need a single one of them to validate my right to exist. Before I get to what happened after I vanished without explanation, let me take you back to where this all began. I grew up in Indianapolis inside a household where success only registered if it matched a conventional mold visible from the street. My father, Richard Mercer, was a mechanical engineer who had spent decades at the same industrial company, and he wielded that steadiness like evidence of his own moral standing. My mother, Helen, taught middle school English and delivered the same rigid expectations with a gentler voice and a pleasant expression rather than volume. My older brother, Ryan, followed prescribed formulas the way some people treat religion as non-negotiable. My sister Brooke had figured out early how to say precisely what each room required and earn the label of mature from every adult nearby. I was the one who made people shift in their seats. At 10 years old, I wasn't out back pretending to run a household. I was converting our garage into a miniature Saturday market, repainting worn-out stools, bundling thrift store dishware into curated sets, and persuading neighbors to purchase them because I wrote handwritten tags that turned every chipped bowl into something with a story worth owning. By 13, I was coaching local craftspeople on how to photograph their work so it would actually sell on the internet. By 16, I was building basic checkout systems for women selling candles, embroidered fabrics, and handcrafted soaps from county fair tables. I was fascinated by the mechanics of how people made purchasing decisions, why a narrative outperformed a list of features, why the way something was presented could completely transform its perceived value. My father wrote all of it off as adorable little side projects, the same way certain men pat a child on the head before turning their full attention somewhere else. He would stand in the kitchen after dinner and tell me repeatedly that cleverness without a diploma was just a hobby with better lighting. My mother would claim he was only thinking about my security. What she actually meant was obedience. When Ryan landed an internship, the family celebrated with steak dinners. When Brooke earned top marks, my parents called grandparents across the country. When I made enough at 17 to cover my own car insurance and purchase my laptop outright in cash, my father barely glanced away from his newspaper. He said that energy would be a lot more impressive if I pointed it toward a real future. I enrolled in college because fighting them felt more exhausting than disappointing myself. I lasted 3 semesters. Every lecture felt like someone explaining business to me through a thick pane of glass, while I was already out in the world getting cut by it. Professors discussed risk in theoretical frameworks. I was already living inside it. They presented customer psychology from presentation slides. I had already discovered through direct experience that women purchased handmade kitchen goods in a completely different headspace at 11 at night on a Tuesday compared to a Sunday market with cash already in their hands. I wasn't unmotivated. I was simply in the wrong environment. But in my household, that distinction didn't exist. The day I told my father I was withdrawing from school, he looked at me the way a judge regards someone who has wasted the court's entire afternoon. He didn't ask what I intended to create. He asked what variety of embarrassment I was planning to inflict on the family name. He said I was choosing hardship because I was too arrogant to accept how the world actually worked. He said no serious person would ever trust a dropout with significant money or meaningful responsibility. My mother wept. Not because she feared I would fail, but because she was afraid of what people would say at church. Ryan laughed when I told him I could generate more from one intelligent business than from a lifetime of performing adequacy. Brooke told me I was romanticizing financial instability because I wanted recognition for being unconventional. I left regardless. I rented a dim upstairs apartment above a laundromat on the east side of the city. I worked until my wrists ached. I taught myself shipping regulations, chargeback disputes, advertising fatigue, packaging overhead, and how to manage a panicking client at 2 a.m. And do you know what stung the most? It wasn't being broke. It was the slow realization that my family would have genuinely preferred to watch me suffer inside a respectable framework than to see me succeed inside one they couldn't comprehend. Have you ever discovered that the people who claim to be protecting you were actually trying to contain the version of you they had no power over? The business that ultimately transformed my life didn't arrive as one clean revelation. It emerged from years of observing talented people collapse, not because they lacked ability, but because they had no infrastructure behind them, no pricing logic, no fulfillment process, and no one guiding them through growth without burning everything they cared about to the ground. I spent my early 20s building storefronts, negotiating shipping discounts, photographing products against borrowed backdrops, and sleeping beside stacked inventory because I hadn't yet earned the right to rent a proper warehouse. I met my mentor, Elena Vasquez, at a regional trade expo in Louisville when I was 23 and trying very hard not to look as desperate as I felt. She had spent years as a buyer for boutique retail chains, and she recognized in 10 minutes what my family had refused to acknowledge across an entire decade. I wasn't scattered. I was commercial. I wasn't unserious. I was simply ahead of schedule. Elena helped me stop operating with the mindset of a freelancer and begin thinking like someone building an institution. Together, we transformed my work into something with actual scale, a commerce and logistics company dedicated to helping small American makers in home goods, textiles, woodworking, ceramics, and specialty food build premium direct-to-consumer operations without getting absorbed and crushed by giant online marketplaces. I manage systems, brand positioning, packaging standards, customer retention programs, wholesale relationships, and eventually proprietary software tools engineered specifically for our sellers. I wasn't moving trinkets across the internet. I was constructing an entire ecosystem. It nearly destroyed me anyway. I maxed out a credit line once and clawed my way back in 6 brutal months. I lost an entire holiday season to a freight disruption that eliminated my margins entirely. I spent 1 full winter wearing gloves indoors because I had chosen my payroll obligations over my heating bill. But every collapse left me with knowledge I couldn't have purchased in any classroom. None of those lessons came attached to a syllabus. They arrived with invoices, sleepless nights, and the full weight of responsibility. By 28, I had a real headquarters, 41 employees, national distribution partners, and a platform that industry analysts kept trying to define too narrowly because they couldn't see how much of our actual value lived in the systems behind the visible storefront. By 30, I had turned down 2 acquisition offers because I valued control over headlines. By 32, my personal stake in the company had made me $31 million. I still hadn't told my family what the real numbers looked like. I told myself I was protecting the relationship. But the uglier truth was that some fractured part of me still wanted them to choose me before my success made rejecting me impossible. So I kept arriving small in rooms where I was carrying the heaviest load. When my mother needed surgery and her insurance stalled on part of the bill, a trust account quietly handled the remainder. When Ryan came up short on closing a house purchase, a solution materialized through a chain of family friends nobody could trace back to me. When Brooke's wedding nearly fell apart after vendor costs spiraled beyond what had been budgeted, the deficit disappeared before she had to cancel a single reservation. My father once referred to himself as the backbone of the entire family, while unknowingly driving a car whose repair I had paid for in full. That was the particular silence I had chosen to inhabit. I would arrange the help at noon and be treated like a cautionary tale by dinner time. The deepest wound came when Ryan mentioned wanting to launch a side business, advising local contractors on property financing. I offered to walk him through building lead generation systems and client nurture sequences that actually produced results. He smirked and said he had no interest in taking business advice from someone who abandoned college and stumbled into online money. My father actually nodded in agreement and said that a formal education instills discipline, and that discipline matters more than hustle. I remember smiling as though it hadn't reached me, because by then I had become fluent in swallowing humiliation whole. But silence does something irreversible when you continue feeding it year after year. It hardens first into distance, then into resentment, and finally into a kind of cold and absolute clarity. I'd been telling myself that my restraint was an act of love, that choosing the high road was a form of dignity, that family deserved infinite patience. I had been wrong on every count. My silence wasn't mending anything. It was simply making the disrespect less expensive for everyone else to maintain. And then my father's 60th birthday arrived, and I made the catastrophic mistake of believing that truth, spoken plainly and without drama, might finally shift something fundamental. I showed up to that dinner with a gift I had spent months designing. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't about settling scores. It was a fully funded retirement account package structured by my financial team so that my parents could stop lying awake over medical surprises and stop pretending that chronic stress was a virtue. I also arrived carrying a private hope I'm almost embarrassed to acknowledge now. I believed that if I showed them what I had actually built, calmly and clearly without any performance, they might finally see me as the person I had become instead of the 19-year-old who had let them down. The dinner began exactly the way family humiliations always begin, with everyone performing normalcy convincingly enough that you start questioning your own instincts. My mother fussed over the roast. Brooke discussed a case her firm had recently won. Ryan kept threading banking terminology into ordinary table conversation because he enjoyed sounding expensive in casual settings. My father held court at the head of the table, basking in the kind of authority that only survives as long as nobody challenges it. Not one person asked me a genuine question. Not about my work, not about my life, not about why I looked leaner, sharper, more worn, more certain than the last time they'd seen me. I sat through dessert in silence, then placed the envelope beside my father's plate and told the table I wanted to share something with them. He opened it carefully, frowned at the figures inside, and asked what he was supposed to be looking at. I explained as plainly as I could that my company had crossed another significant valuation threshold, that I had arranged something concrete for their future security, and that I wanted them to be comfortable because I loved them. The room went completely silent. Ryan was the first one to laugh, and it wasn't a warm sound. He asked whether this was one of those internet-rich situations where people talked about paper valuations and drove leased vehicles. Brooke told me not to make their father's birthday about my personal brand. My father stared at the documents as though they had personally insulted him. Then, with a measured contempt in his voice, he asked whether I believed that distributing money gave me the same standing as people who had gone about life the proper way. I told him it wasn't about standing, it was about caring for people I loved. I said I had been helping from the background for years because I never wanted anyone to feel exposed or indebted. That was the moment the entire evening came apart. My mother stared at me with genuine confusion. Ryan went white and then visibly furious. Brooke demanded to know exactly what I was implying. I should have stopped there. But perhaps because the exhaustion had finally accumulated past what I could manage, perhaps because some old and deep wound had finally torn completely open, I told them. Not the full accounting, not every figure, but enough. I told them I had covered a portion of my mother's medical bills. I had helped Ryan close on his house. I had kept Brooke's wedding intact when no one else at that table knew how close it had come to unraveling entirely. I didn't say any of it to humiliate them. I said it because I wanted, for once in my life, the actual truth to occupy the same room as all of us. My father pushed back from the table so fast the chair legs scraped across the floor. He didn't look grateful. He looked trapped. That was the precise moment I understood that certain people would rather label you vindictive than acknowledge that they have needed you. Ryan asked whether I thought this positioned him as some kind of charity case. Brooke accused me of being manipulative for handling things without telling them. My mother kept crying and repeating that she didn't understand why I would do all of that in secret, as if the answer hadn't been sitting at the head of the table for my entire life. Then my father started shouting. He said I had come into his home to purchase authority. He said money built by a dropout would never earn his respect. He said I had no business making people with legitimate educations feel diminished. Ryan joined in, then Brooke. Together, they mocked what they called my little empire, ridiculed my lack of credentials, and treated the company employing dozens of people and supporting hundreds of small makers as an embarrassing accident that reflected poorly on them by association. I kept my voice completely level. That seemed to infuriate my father beyond what he could contain. He jabbed a finger toward the front door and called me uneducated trash with good timing. Then louder, because cruelty always performs better for a watching crowd, he told me to get out of his house and never come back, pretending that money made me one of them. One of them, as though I had ever been genuinely permitted to belong. I remember picking up my bag. I remember my hands being completely steady even as my chest felt carved hollow. I remember moving my eyes across each face one final time. My mother was staring at the tablecloth. Brooke looked ashamed, but said absolutely nothing. Ryan looked almost satisfied, as though something dark and long nurtured inside him had finally been permitted to surface. I looked at my father and said, "Okay, fine." That was the entirety of it. No declaration, no tears, no waiting for anyone in that room to step forward and stand beside me. I walked out to the driveway and sat inside my car for nearly 2 full minutes without turning the key. I didn't cry immediately. I just looked through the windshield and felt something inside me go cold and strangely clean, not shattered, finished. By the time I pulled away from the curb, the decision was already made. I was not going to spend another year auditioning for love inside a family that only respected me when I was smaller than they needed to be. I drove back to my condo and packed until the sky turned pale. I deleted the family group chat, sealed every family photograph into boxes, left my old house key on my kitchen counter, and by morning I was on the highway heading to Charleston. I sent no letter. I offered no explanation. 3 weeks later, they would discover that my silence was not the quiet of someone who had given up. It was the sound of a door being locked permanently behind them. Charleston didn't fix me overnight. What it gave me was room to stop performing entirely. I had purchased a restored coastal cottage there the previous year as an investment property, a place I had told myself I might actually use someday when my life became less cluttered. I arrived with boxes, bone-deep exhaustion, and a fury so carefully managed it almost had a quality of elegance to it. The first thing I did was strip the entire house of anything that felt borrowed or generic. I pulled down the impersonal wall art, unpacked handmade pieces from artists I'd worked alongside for years, and filled the kitchen with objects created by people who built things with their hands rather than opinions with their mouths. Then I did something small and almost irrational. I deleted every family photograph from my phone and burned a cardboard box of old birthday cards and holiday notes in a metal fire pit behind the house. Not out of hatred, out of necessity. I needed one physical act that declared this chapter of my life was over. I began sleeping through the night for the first time in months. I walked the neighborhood before sunrise every morning. I adopted a rescue dog with one torn ear and named her June. I leased a studio space downtown and began hosting small workshops for makers and women, building product businesses outside the conventional gate-kept channels. The first session was planned for 12 people. 47 walked through the door. Some came for the strategy. Some came because they had been told so many times that they were being unrealistic that they no longer trusted their own sense of what they were capable of. I recognized every single face in that room. Then Ryan appeared at my front door on a humid Saturday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after I had left Indianapolis. He was wearing the same expression of effortless superiority he'd carried his entire life, the look of someone who believed that charm could always be converted into leverage. But there was strain around his eyes now, visible even through the performance. He didn't apologize. He opened with family as a concept. He said our father had been under enormous pressure, that milestone birthdays made people emotional, that perhaps I had allowed things to affect me more than they deserved. Then he transitioned almost seamlessly into the actual reason he had made an 11-hour drive to my front door. A real estate deal had gone sideways. He needed money quickly. Just a bridge between siblings, he said, a temporary arrangement. I asked him plainly whether he had driven 11 hours to offer an apology or to make a withdrawal. He didn't appreciate that framing. He began invoking blood, shared history, and family loyalty, the specific vocabulary people reach for when they want access without any accompanying accountability. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was my CFO on speaker because I had been working through a contract review all morning. Ryan stood there and listened while I confirmed the terms on a 7-figure licensing agreement and approved the first phase of a multi-state expansion. I didn't lower my voice. I didn't send the call to voicemail. I didn't perform humility for his benefit anymore. When I ended the call, he was staring at me as though he had finally come face to face with a complete stranger who happened to be wearing my face. I told him no. Not no for now. No as in no loans, no emergency rescues, no further quiet funding for people who degraded me publicly and counted on my silence privately. He said our father had been right about me all along and that achievement had turned me selfish. I told him that success hadn't changed who I was. It had simply made it impossible for people like him to keep insisting that I owed them everything while deserving nothing in return. He left angry, embarrassed, and considerably more unsettled than he wanted me to observe. I later learned he drove directly back to Indianapolis and told everyone what he had witnessed. The house, the deal, the scope of the money, the reality that I'd accumulated far more than any of them had ever bothered to imagine. That conversation became the first fracture in the story they had been telling about me for years. It also marked the beginning of what came next for all of them.